So let's start looking at how we can utilize this particular scale, the how can I use it section of this particular course. Now, the first way that we can use this, and we're going to look at a few, is a really simple way that is used all the time in jam sessions. When you get a bunch of guys together and they've never played together before, you turn up at a pub or a club or whatever, and people say, let's just jam something. Generally what people do is they will do an extended jam on a 1 or 2 chord vamp, often a 1 chord vamp. And usually one of 2 chord types gets picked. It's either a minor 7 or a dominant 7th. And when they pick the minor 7 chord, people play all their minor pentatonic kind of stuff. And when they pick the dominant 7th chord, people play all their minor pentatonic stuff. Because guitar players love to use the minor pentatonic. And it's an awesome scale. If I was to play a groove that was like... we had that groove back in the What Is It section. That kind of G9 chord, sliding up and back down again, sliding up 2 frets and back down. That classic kind of G7 or G9 blues vibe. Okay, and most people when they hear it, they will play their minor pentatonic scale over it. Here's a little tip for you, and this is the first use of our Lydian dominant scale. Whenever you have a static dominant 7th chord, i.e. static meaning it's not going anywhere, there's no other chord in the progression, we're just static, we're going to stick on a static G7 vamp in this case. If the chord is a G7, a G9, a G7 sharp 11, a G9 sharp 11, or a G13, we can play this Lydian dominant scale, and we should play this Lydian dominant scale over the top. Okay, you might hear people talk about the Mixolydian scale, the major pentatonic. Those are also options as well that sound great. Okay, but here's a little caveat to this. If the chord contains a sus4, okay, so G7 sus4, sounds like this, or very common sound. That would be G7 or G9 sus4. This isn't going to work because that's a natural 4 in that chord rather than our sharpened 4th or sharpened 11th. Okay, also known as G11 in some cases. Okay, don't play the Lydian dominant if there's a natural 4 in the chord or a sus4 in the chord. Okay, also if the chord is some kind of altered chord, and you'll know if it's an altered chord because it's got a sharp something else other than 11 in there. So if it's like a sharp 9 or a sharp 5 or a flattened something like a flattened 5th or a flattened 9th, then this isn't going to work because as we've seen, those intervals are not in our scale. You've got to remember what intervals are in our Lydian dominant scale: 1, 2 or 9, 3, sharp 4, 5, 6 or 13, and flat 7. If you see any other intervals kicking around, the likelihood is it's probably not going to work. But for static dominant 7th chords, G7, G9, G7 sharp 11, G9 sharp 11, G13, this is going to work absolutely brilliantly. We're going to be able to play this scale for days and it's going to sound really, really cool and really, really hip. And the great thing about this is we can use it on top of all of our standard minor pentatonic, or if you use the Mixolydian scale, if you know what that is. If not, don't worry. If you use the Mixolydian scale, this is going to work great over the top of that. Okay, as an addition. And because we got that sharp 11 in there, that gives us that really exotic, jazzy sounding note that can really make your improvisation stand out from the crowd. And that's the great thing about this scale, because it outlines the sound of our dominant 7th, but we've got this really hip sounding sharp 11 note. Okay, so I've got this groove here. Here it is. There's the groove. Now, initially what I'm going to do is I'm going to play my minor pentatonic over it. So just the G minor. You can hear how that works, and if you know anything about blues phrasing, you'll know that we need to put the major 3rd in there as well. Again, that's not why I'm here to teach you about that, but I'm going to play my blues phrases basically. So the initial thing is going to be something along these lines improvisationally. Okay, so far, very standard kind of blues vocabulary, okay? Around that minor pentatonic with the major third added in, that minor to major third. Juxtaposition is very bluesy, okay? Now, as soon as I add in my G7 sharp 11 sound, my Lydian dominant note, now let's take this sharp 11 just here, which is at the 2nd fret of the B string, okay? That came from our arpeggio. Okay, remember that arpeggio shape? Now I can combine that with my minor pentatonic. So for instance, if I go up the arpeggio and then come down my blues sound, that sharp 11 is going to sound really cool and hip against the chord, this static G7 vamp. So I'm just going to mess around a little bit now and grab that sharp 11 from time to time improvisationally, and I'm going to be thinking about the Lydian dominant scale as well as this kind of standard kind of blues vocabulary. Okay, so we get this kind of a sound. So there you can hear how that sharp 11 is adding something unique to that kind of blues sound, okay? It's giving you an interesting extra note to grab as well as your standard minor pentatonic and your standard kind of arpeggios sound, your dominant 7th arpeggios go. So utilize that sound whenever you feel like it, and when you play it a lot you'll get used to how it sounds and you'll start to hear it in your playing. So identify across the neck where those sharp 11 intervals are, and this is where that idea that I talked about in the what is it section of knowing where those intervals are is going to help you a great deal. If you can see this G and find that sharp 11 and also be able to see that around that minor pentatonic, it's going to help you out. It gives you a really nice jazzy sound that's really going to enhance your playing. Okay, so this will also work. I'm going to show you this in a funk context now. So we're going to play over a loop now that's kind of like this kind of G9, kind of James Brown-esque kind of sound. Okay, so that kind of sound, let's have a listen to how the Lydian dominant benefits soloing over that kind of sound as well. And again, we can use the minor pentatonic, we can use our mixed Lydian scale, but adding in this sharp 11 is going to give us this really cool kind of hip sound. So let's have a listen to that now. Okay, so there you could hear how that works in the Lydian dominant works in that kind of a context, that kind of funk context. And again, on these static kind of vamps, this works really, really well and adds in this kind of interesting harmonic element. Now, a really quick aside, if you noticed some of the fingerings there looks a bit strange, that's because for the performance I tuned the guitar slightly differently because I don't actually play in standard tuning normally, so it's easier for me for the performance elements if I'm tuned to my tuning, which is where I've got all fourth intervals down the guitar, so E, A, D, G, C and F. That's the only reason things looked a little bit different, but I was using exactly the same material. The only other thing I did was threw a little bit of chromaticism in there as well, and again that's hard for me to switch off as a kind of jazz guy. But generally what I was doing was just thinking about the G Lydian dominant scale and the chord tones and outlining that sharp 11 interval over that G9 chord, okay? So in that kind of static context, this works incredibly well. Okay, the only other thing that's worth adding here is even if you've got 3 or 4 dominant 7th chords in a groove and they bear no relationship to each other in terms of a key, they're just kind of moving around randomly. So say for instance, if you think of a band like Jamiroquai, the old kind of funk band, I don't even know if they still do stuff anymore, but let's say we take that G9 chord and we have a kind of funk vibe. And then we move that down 3 frets. That's a real common funk thing to do. Let me play that for you. So G9 going down to E9. You hear that all the time, okay? Now, those 2 chords, they're just static dominant 7th chords. They don't move around in a key, for instance. They're what we call non-functional. They don't kind of function in a normal kind of dominant 7th way. Well, we can play G Lydian dominant over that one and E Lydian dominant over this one. Okay, so whenever you see that, these chords come from the Lydian dominant scale. This one hasn't got a natural 4 in it, and it hasn't got any altered extensions, so flat or sharpened 9ths or 5ths. So it's going to work great. These are just 2 9 chords. So let me play over that one fairly quickly as well. The difficulty we've got here is we need to switch to the E Lydian dominant for this chord and then back to G Lydian dominant for this chord. So you need to know these scales really well. But if you know where the root notes are, you can find the G, let's say here, and then an E here, and then a G here, and an E here. And you know those intervals, you can play melodies and runs based off of your knowledge of the intervals and the 5 positions of the scale, okay? So this is why we need to learn scales really well. Fretboard knowledge is your friend. So let's play over that groove now, the G9 going to the E9, and this is another context, static dominant 7th chords, but then they move to another static dominant 7th chord of the same type, so G9 to E9 in this case. Okay, let's have a listen. Okay, so there you can hear how that Lydian dominant fits great over that kind of context as well. So, just to sum up, we can use this Lydian dominant over static dominant 7th grooves, i.e. dominant 7ths that don't work in the standard kind of context. We're not using them in a key, we're not trying to create a chord progression as such, we're just using a static or a single dominant 7th. We can move them around a little bit like that, so I had the G going to the E, but generally it's just a static dominant 7th that's not got any altered extensions, so flat 9, sharp 9, flat 5, sharp 5, and doesn't have a suspended 4th or a natural 4th in it. So that would be G7, G9, G7 sharp 11, G9 sharp 11, G13, anything with any of those intervals in, and it's static like that, we're good to go. So now I want to have a look at another context We're going to finish with the blues, but for now, let's have a look at another context, called non-resolving dominance. And this is where we use it more in the context of a key. So let's do that now.